13, verses 1 through 13. Genesis 13, 1 through 13. Please rise for the reading of the Bible. When Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from thee, if thou wilt take the left hand, and I will go to the right. Well, I think this is like changed. For thou depart from the right hand, then I'll go to the left. Sorry, I got to change this back later, but please read with me. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Together? But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Amen. You may be seated. Okay, so we're going to do a little review here because it's kind of important for today's sermon. So Abram comes back to Canaan from Egypt, right? So before we get to his coming back to Canaan, I want you guys to have a basic visualization of where Abram is traveling. So here's Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was... And Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your seed I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord, who appeared to him. And he moved out from that place to a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So can we get a map up there? Okay, so this is where he started, over here. And could you press one forward button? There should be a circle over here. There it is. This is where he started. And he went up here with Terah, his father. Terah died in there, and then Abram came all the way back from there into this land over here. So this... I don't know, can you zoom in on this, or is it not possible? If it's not, that's okay. Over here, if it's possible. If it's not, it's okay. Yeah, that's Shechem. That's what we're reading about right now. So Abram comes from the north into Shechem, and then he moves a little past it to this area over here. And this is called the plains of Moreh. So next slide. To zoom in a little bit to know what we're talking about here. Okay, so you see, actually, let me get this pointer over here. See if it works. Okay, so here's Bethel, here's Ai. Shechem is like up here. So Abram comes down. This is the plains of Moreh. This is the plains of Moreh, and then he goes, there's a mountainous area here. So Abram goes up to the mountain here. And he pitches his tent here between Bethel and Ai. Bethel to the west and Ai on the east. Does that make sense? Okay, next slide. This geography is kind of important because we'll talk about why it's important later. But yeah, so it's up here. This is the area that we're talking about here, this mountainous area. So again, this is Bethel or Luz. There's two I's here. I don't know if you can see that. The one at the top is the Abraham's or Joshua's eye. It's the one at the bottom. You see there's two dots here? This becomes later important when we talk about Joshua and Abram. So you see these two dots here. There's actually three, but here's the eye of Joshua, eye of Joshua, and then at the bottom here is eye of Abraham. So Bethel is over here, and Abram pitched his tent somewhere in here, where it's like mountainous here. Next line. And a mountainous region, or like a mountainous view of it. So here's Bethel again, eye. You can see that it's above the valleys here. Can you guys see that? This is a high place. This is a low place. This is very, very important when we talk about later. We read it today, but Lot going to Sodom and Gomorrah. This is very important because Lot is going down. Lot is going down. Okay. So I want you guys to have a visualization. So it's the place where they're at the top, and then Abram traveled all the way from here into Egypt, which is out of the map, but he traveled all the way to Egypt because there was no food. And then Abram comes back into the southern Canaan area, and then he goes all the way back up here. Is Genesis 13, which is today's passage. He comes back up. So he goes into Egypt, then he comes all the way back up into where he put that altar, and he prays again. He calls upon the name of God. Any questions or comment about the map here? Okay. So Abram comes back into the land that God had promised to give Abram and his children. He comes back, and when Abram enters Canaan at first, Abram passes Shechem, right? So he passes Shechem down, and then he goes all the way back into Egypt, and then after the events of Egypt, he comes all the way back up to the high mountain. Before Abram went down, we said that Abram was praying to God that he lessen the famine. And as said before, and we don't have time to go into it, but we'll talk more into details about this later. But, all right, I said at that time that we're going to talk about it later. And then now is the later time that we'll talk about, well, how do we know Abram prayed to God? All the passage says is Abram made an altar, and he called upon the name of the Lord. How can we deduce from that Abram prayed to God to lessen the famine? And when we talked about it like 5 weeks ago, I said we don't have time to talk about it now, but we'll talk about it later when Abram comes back up. So this is the time that we'll talk about it now. So why do we conclude that at that time, in Genesis 12, Abram was praying, and he was praying for the lessening of the famine? How do we conclude that? Well, here's some of the verses talking about what it means when somebody calls upon the name of God, or when somebody calls upon God. This is 1 Kings chapter 18, 24, and so on. And call you on the name of your gods. This is Elijah. When he's having a fight with the Baal worshipers, and he's saying, well, I have a deal. How about both of us call the names of our gods? And whoever lights this sacrifice on fire, that's the true God. That's what he's talking about here. So call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God that answers by fire, let him be God. And all the people answered and said, it is well spoken. We agree. Let's do this competition. 1 Chronicles 16:8, give thanks to the Lord. This is David praising God. Give thanks to the Lord. Call upon his name. Make known his deeds among the people. And these yellow signs over here is my question. What deeds is David talking about? When he says, call upon the name of God to make his deeds known, what deeds are we what is he talking about? And he repeats it again in Psalm 105, verse 1. Oh, give thanks to the Lord. Call upon the name of God. Make known his deeds known among the people. And again, I go, what deeds? Psalm 116:13. I will take the cup of salvation and call upon the name of God. Aha. So there's an empty cup, and it's an empty cup of salvation, and David lifts it up to God. What is he asking God to do? He has an empty cup of salvation, and he lifts it toward God. Well, what's he asking God to do? So he has an empty cup of salvation. This cup represents David's salvation, and he lifts it toward God. What is he asking God to do? So he has a cup. David has a cup, and it's empty. And he lifts it toward God. What does he want God to do with that empty cup? Fill it, yeah. And what does that cup represent? Why is David giving that cup? What kind of cup is it? It's the cup of salvation. So he's lifting the cup of salvation toward God. What is he asking God to do? It's an empty cup of salvation, and he lifts it toward God. What is he asking God to do with that empty cup of salvation? Fill it with, it's the cup of salvation. So he's asking God to fill it with salvation. I'm not asking hard questions here. David can't save himself, right? So the way he wants to represent this in musical lyrics is, I have this empty cup of salvation, and I'm holding it towards the Lord so that God fills that cup of salvation. Does that make sense? And another way of saying that is to call upon God, call upon the name of God. I promise I'm not asking any hard questions here. You just have to pay attention to what the Bible is saying. That's it. Hide not your face from me in the day when I am in trouble. Incline your ear to me in the day when I call. Answer me with speed. So why is this guy calling out then? It's David. I mean, but why is he calling out to God? Why? Because hide not your face from me in the day that when yeah, so why is he calling out to God? Yeah, because he's in trouble, which means the reason he's calling out to God is, what does he want God to do for him? He said, I'm in trouble, right? So what does he want God? Is he just letting God know that he's in trouble? I'm just stating a fact, God, I'm in trouble. Thank you for listening. Is that what the person's saying? What's the person wanting? Yeah, God, help me because I'm in trouble. So he's not just stating a fact here. Does that make sense? The psalmist here wants God to help him because salvation belongs to God. That's the point. He wants some kind of help from God. That's why he's calling on the name of God. That's why he's calling on God. Next slide. He shall come upon me, and I will answer. This is God talking. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. So if the person calls upon God, what's God going to do? So the person who's in trouble, he's calling upon God, and God promises he shall call upon me, and what's God going to do? Answer him. And be with him. And deliver him and honor him. Right? This is very important because there's a reason why Abram went to between the mountain of Bethel and the high, and then made an altar and called upon God's name. There's a reason for that. I'm trying to show you what that reason is. Isaiah 58:9. Then you shall call, and then the insert is a Paul. This is not in the verse, but calling here means calling upon God, or calling upon the name of God. And the Lord shall answer. You will cry out, and he will say, here I am. If you take away from the midst of yourself the yoke, the putting forth the finger, and speaking vanity. So he's talking about oppression, the yoke, and then putting forth the finger, wrongfully or unjustly criticizing people, and the speaking vanity. He's talking about like lies, or like things that are not true about the person, or things that are unjustly said about the person. Speaking vanities. God says, put these things away. In the day that you call me, when you call me, the Lord will answer. And when you cry out, I'm going to say, here I am. Right? So calling upon the name of God, you don't just call upon for no reason. You want to make the world known something about God's deeds. That's the point. And my question is, well, what deeds are we trying to make God known? What deeds about God are we trying to make known when we call upon God? What are we trying to make known about God then when we call upon God? In other words, what do we want other people to know about the God that we're calling on when we call on God? And not just help. Remember, David called upon God because The cup of salvation. David called upon God because what did he need? Not just want, but what did he need? Salvation. So when the people of God call upon God's name, we want the world to know there's only one being that's able to save us from all things. And that's God. It's salvation that's at stake here. And we want all the other people to know the God that we believe in is a God of salvation. He's the one that saves all his people. And that's what I'm trying to get across. That's what when the Bible repeats something, it's very important. When the Bible often repeats something, it's very important. When the Bible repeatedly repeats something, it's super, super, super important. That's like the point of what the Bible is getting at then. And we just saw like at least 8 verses here, right? But there's more. This is only like a sample. Here's Isaiah 65:24. And it will come to pass that before they call upon my name, I will answer. And while they are yet speaking, I will hear. These all are talking about how God will save his people. Those who call upon the name of God, God will save. That's the point that God is making here again, again, and again. Here's Joel. And it will come to pass that whosoever will call on the name of the Lord will be delivered. Because in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, and in the remnant whom the Lord will call. Next line. Jeremiah. Call unto me, and I will answer you, and show you great and mighty things which you know not. He's talking about salvation. Psalm 18:3. I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be helped? Benefited? What's the word? Saved from my enemies. Our God is the God of salvation. That's the point. And it will come to pass, and they're just repeating. So in the New Testament, they're saying, we're not getting this thing out of nowhere. We're actually borrowing from Old Testament theology. And they're quoting Joel here, both Paul and Luke. And it will come to pass that whosoever call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That's from Acts. And whosoever call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Joel again. And here's a story in Matthew that you guys know about, but I want you guys to read the specific words that are written down because there's a reason why it's written down in this specific way. But when Peter saw the wind being boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink in the water, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. Who was he calling upon? Yeah, he's calling upon God. He's saying, Jesus Christ, you're the Son of God. Save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? All this to say, that's how we concluded that when Abram went between Bethel and Ai, the mountainous area between Bethel, and made an altar and called upon the name of God, what he was calling out is salvation from the famine is the point. That's how we concluded that. It's because the rest of the Bible are replete. The rest of the Bible is full of instances where whenever people call upon the name of God, it's because they're in trouble. And they feel like, not even they feel like, they are about to die. And they want God to save them from this, imminent death. So again, if you remember, this is all the way back like last year, when we're talking about Enos's generation. In Genesis 4:26, and to Seth, to him there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. And then during Enos's generation, men began to call upon the name of the Lord for salvation, for deliverance. That's why they were calling upon the name of God. Why? Because I suggested that there was a type of dwarfism where it made those affected smaller than the rest. Right? So now they're being oppressed by those that are bigger than they are. And then you get to Genesis 6, where there's giants in the land. Well, they're giants because these people are dwarves. They're smaller. Does that make sense? So Abram calls upon the name of the Lord. And he's begging for salvation from the famine. In other words, God, lessen the famine. Deliver me from this famine. Please lessen this famine. But the famine's getting worse and worse. Which is why Abram then heads towards Egypt. So Abram heads towards Egypt because it seems like God's not listening to his prayers. Then, after the events of Egypt, he heads back up into the south of Canaan, heads back up there. And then from there, Abram heads all the way back up to the north, where he was first there, where he first made that altar. So this is Genesis chapter 13 now. And then Abram calls upon the name of God again. He prays again. He begs for salvation again. So here's Genesis 13, verse 4. Genesis 13:4. Unto the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Which means he went there to pray again. Question. How do we know, this is from last week, how do we know Abram was influenced by Sarai's faithfulness toward God to also become faithful toward God? How do we know that? It's okay, because this is from last week. So an embedded question in there, or you could say like a lower tier. Maybe if we answer like these other questions, then we can answer that bigger question. So here's a like a embedded question in there. Where did Abraham return to after coming out of Egypt? And that's pretty obvious here. Where did Abram return to? Yeah, Canaan. And what's the exact place he returned to, though? Yeah, the altar that he set up between Bethel and Hai. Right, that's what we're talking about all this time, is he set up an altar there to pray to God. And then he went down into Egypt because the famine kept getting worse and worse. And then he came all the way back up to that same spot after after the events in Egypt. So that's the answer. Remember, I don't ask any hard questions. You just have to pay attention to what the Bible is saying, and that's it. So he went down, and then he went back up to the exact same place where the altar was. Second question, why did Abram return to that altar? For what purpose did Abram return to that altar? What's he trying to do there? Or what did Abram do the first time he was there? What did Abram do the first time he was there at that altar? He called the name. Otherwise, in other words, he prayed. He prayed God for salvation. Then he returned there. Well, why did he return there? What's the obvious answer? To pray again. Yeah, to pray again. It's very simple. He went there to pray the first time, and then he came back up there to pray again. And then our question is, what does he want to pray about this time? Because isn't he wealthy now? Isn't that what Genesis 13, 1 and 2 is saying? Abram came out wealthy. So what's the problem? Before, you can kind of like, okay, so he was a little bit poor. So we can kind of understand like, all right, Abram, you're a little bit poor. There's a famine in the land. Okay, we see why you need to beg God. We see why you need to pray God with this famine incident. Abram's rich now. He has much cattle. There's no way he can starve here. But why does he go back there to pray? What's the point? So here's what I want to show you guys. This is called a chiasm. It's a Hebraic literary structure that the writers of the Old Testament and the New Testament use to focus on a certain so they want to make a point, and they make that you could say like the peak of the chiasm, and then they work around that. They work the narrative around that so that we understand this is where the peak is, and then what I want you guys to do is compare and contrast the before and after the peak. Does that make sense? So it's a literary device, Hebraic literary device. So this is from 12 and 13 together. Abram prays, God lets in the famine at Bethel and Hai. That's what happens in Genesis 12. And then Abram continues south. Abram goes down into Egypt fairly poorly. He's not rich. He's very poor, which is why he's going there, because he's afraid his family is going to end up begging the Canaanites or something to that effect. Maybe they'll starve. So he's afraid for these things, and it doesn't seem like God is listening to his prayers. Famine is getting worse, so he's like, well, I'll just temporarily go to Egypt. So he goes down to Egypt, is how the Bible phrased it. Then Abram sells out Sarai. Right? He says, oh, say that you're my wife, or say that you're my sister, not my wife. You guys remember that? Sells her out. But then God saves Sarai, right, from Pharaoh's son. He rebukes the Pharaoh saying, hey, don't you know this is the wife of Abram? And then Abram is confronted for his lies by the Pharaoh. Okay? And then there's a blank here, because this is what we need to figure out. Then Abram goes back up from Egypt, rich in cattle, rich in gold and silver. So he's wealthy now. And continues north into southern Canaan. So now he's going up out of Egypt. And then Abram prays God concerning the famine again. At the same place he prayed. Do you understand this chiasm? So the focus is God saves Sarai. That's the focus. And what we want to do is compare and contrast the before and after that focal point. So before, Abram is going down. You guys see that? He's going down into Egypt. Morally, he's going down. He's like selling his wife. Spiritually, he's going down. He can't believe that God is not listening to his prayers. So, he believes this lie about God. And, maybe God can't save me. Maybe God doesn't know. Maybe he's not powerful enough to stop this famine. So he's spiritually going down. God saves Sarai. And from that event, everything is going back up now. Abram is going back up. Does that make sense? There's a blank, so we're trying to figure that out. He's spiritually going back up because now he wants to stay in the land of Canaan. And now we know that from Genesis 13, the passage we read today. Any questions or comments so far? So how do we know Abram prays God concerning the famine again? Because I made this assertion, but how do we know he's praying for it again? Because of the following verses that indicate problems arising due to the famine once again. So here's Genesis chapter 13, verse 3 and 4. Oh, and 15 and 16, 5 and 6. So, okay, so to the place, so he's going back up. Abram called upon the name of the Lord, so he's there. So he's doing some kind of prayer. We don't know what he's praying for yet, but he's making a prayer. Does that make sense? Because he went back up to the altar, and he's calling upon God's name. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks, herds, and tents. So Lot also became rich off of Abraham in Egypt. Does that make sense? Lot also became rich. Next verses. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. Aha, that's why Abram's praying. There's a famine in the land. That means there's not enough grazing area. There's not enough water. There's not enough grazing area. That's what a famine means. There's not enough food that's being grown there. So when Abram went down, the land itself didn't suffer because he was poor. Does that make sense? But now they come up rich with all these cattle and sheep and, things that eat grass and eat the bushes. The land itself can't bear them, and the land was not able to bear them. So whatever the famine situation was in Canaan, it became worse because of them. Does that make sense? And now, even though they're wealthy, the land can't sustain them because of their wealth. So their wealth is a negative, it's a negative aspect. And of course, we can understand because what happened in Egypt is negative. Like Abram shouldn't have gone there in the first place, but the wealth itself is negative right now because it looks like, oh, now you're wealthy, you can live, you don't have to worry about starving and stuff. Well, it doesn't look like that anymore because now there's not enough food to feed everything. So at this point, the average reader during Abram's time, or even post Abram's time, the average reader, so they would look at these verses, they would look at these passages and go, they would look at these stories that they're either hearing orally or, if it's written down, they're reading and they go, well, that's kind of strange. Abram is wealthy and this wealth is not helping him. It's actually contributing to the famine. See that point? His wealth is now contributing to the famine. So before we were like, well, Abram is just not wealthy enough. Maybe if he just had more stuff, if he had more animals to, eat, or maybe if he had more, maybe then, his famine problem would be solved. No, it's actually making it worse. And then when they find out, so now Abram has to pray because it's making it worse, the reader would realize that Abram realized that his wealth from Egypt not only does not help him with the famine, but makes additional issues. So because now the land is unable to bear both Abram's flock and then Lot's flock, their shepherds and their herdsmen are fighting with each other. And what you realize here is Lot is not the first one to make peace with Abram. And we said this last week. Do you guys know why? Because Lot is a conniving jerk. He would rather fight with Abram for the scraps of the land because there's not enough food going around than to first say, Uncle, let's make peace. You can just take all my stuff. Okay, let's not have separate wealth here. Let's just combine our wealth together. You can have all my wealth. Let me just stay with you in this land of Canaan. Is not what Lot does. He says, even if I end up starving my uncle out, I'm not going to give him my wealth. I'm going to hold on to this. It's Abram who comes first to Lot and goes, Lot, how about we just separate? If you go this way, I'll go that way. If you go up, I'll go down. If you go down, I'll go up. Abram's the one who suggests this. It's Abram who's the peacemaker and suggests that they split. And if you look at Genesis 13:12, Abram stays in the land of Canaan while Lot goes out of the land of Canaan. And we'll talk about this in detail next time. So next week and the week after, we'll talk about this. And this is important because Abram is actually offering Lot to stay within the land. He's saying, if you go to northern Canaan, I'll go to southern Canaan. If you go to eastern Canaan, I'll stay in the western Canaan. Right? He's saying, let us not fight. If you want to hold on to your wealth, you can hold on to your wealth, but let us not fight about this. The land is big. Right? It's big, so wherever you go, I'll just go the opposite direction. But Lot ends up leaving Canaan because the land outside of Canaan is more grassy and it has more water there. We'll talk about that later, though. So for our purpose today, the question is, what brought about this change in Abram? That's the question. That he's the peacemaker here, rather than, if you remember from Egypt, he was willing to sell out his own wife to save his own skin. What change happened? That's what we're trying to figure out. So again, in biblical literature, chiasm helps us to identify important subtexts. So it helps us identify what's the point that's being made, and that's why that chiasm is helpful. In other words, it lets us know what the order of the narrative is and what the order that the God and through the human author, God wants to get across using that narrative, using that chiasm. That's what the chiasm is useful for. So if you look at letters A through D in the chiasm, again, it's a downward trend, not only physically, but morally and spiritually. And then here, it's an upward trend, not only physically, but also morally and spiritually. Does that make sense? Because there's a reversal here in the middle when God saved Sarah, or after God saved Sarah. So the idea of the writer here, namely God, but also the human author, they want to get across a reversal in Abram's faith. That's what they're trying to get across, because Abram starts praying to God. He thinks God's not listening, which is why he goes down into Egypt. But after God saves Sarai, he goes back up and then prays to God again. So there's a reversal in Abram's faith towards God. That's the point that the narrator wants to make. That's why everything's reversed here, because the writer wants to make sure we understand there's a reversal in who Abraham is right now. He was a conniving person like Lot, like the rest of his family, like Laban, like Rebekah, et cetera, but now there's a change in Abram because of Sarah and because of God saving Sarah for Sarah's faith's sake. So what's the reversal? So here, if this is a reversal, Abram sells Sarah out, and then here's the blank. So if those are reversals, what is the reversal of Abram's faith? Seeing that it was Sarai's faith that saved her from the evil situation that Abram put her in. So what's the reversal of that? If Abram sells Sarah out, right? He sold Sarah out. He goes, "Hell, I don't care if you get raped. I don't care if you made a concubine. At least I'll live." That was his attitude. What's the reversal of that? After seeing by Sarah's faith, God saved Sarah. In other words, how would Abram now react in a similar situation now that his faith has been reversed for the better? Or maybe we could put it this way. If his actions demonstrated his denial of faith by selling out Sarah, because now he's concerned about his own skin, right? Then what's the reversal of that? What's the reversal of denying the promise of God? What's the opposite of that? The reversal of that. What's the opposite of denying God's promise? Yeah, accepting and even affirming, saying this is true. Because previously he denied it by selling out Sarah, but now he's saying this is true. So now with the reversal of Abram's faith, he can assert or affirm God's promise. He can say God's promise is true. So that blank in the chiasm then, what is the reversal of throwing Sarah under the bus due to the lack of faith? What's the reversal of that? He threw Sarah under the bus. What would be a reversal of that? And that's what tells us then what this blank is, which then tells us the kind of person he turned into, which then tells us why he prayed for the famine, which then tells us why he's standing in the land of Canaan. You see how pivotal this is? Well, that blank over there, there's two things. First, to adopt the faith of Sarah. So Abram now adopts Sarai's faith. What was Sarai's faith? To serve God despite the suffering. That's Sarai's faith. To hold to the integrity of her faith despite the evil that Abram put her under. It's to hold to the integrity. So it's to remain faithful toward God as his servant. That's the first thing. Second thing, Abram is now to take responsibility as God's servant for Sarai, so that Sarai can participate in his inheritance as well. That's the reversal here. So previously, Abram sells Sarah out. But now the reversal of that is he wants to make sure she also partakes in his inheritance. Does that make sense? In simpler words, the reversal of selling Sarah out is to make sure Sarah receives with Abraham the promise of God of having the seeds take over that land of Canaan. So instead of throwing Sarah under the bus, now Abraham wants to make sure she partakes in that. And that's what leads to Abraham now. Everything Abraham does from this point on, except for one or two instances later on. We'll talk about that when we get there. But now he has he has a transformation of faith. It's a reversal where it goes, what Sarah has is the proper faith. That's the real faith. What I had, this was nothing. This was like emotionalism, so to speak. Which is why he goes up to his previous altar to pray, now having learned the proper faith from Sarai, to hold God's promise even if it means to suffer for it. So now Abram is willing to stay in the land of Canaan despite the famine. Because there's a reversal of faith there. And he's willing to suffer for the sake of remaining faithful to God. That's the reversal. And put all of his trust in God in the same manner that Sarah put all of her faith in God. And this is why now Abram is a peacemaker. Instead of throwing Lot under the bus and saying, Lot, get out. All your wealth came from me, is what Abram would have said before. Does that make sense? Because the type of guy that he was is to save his own skin. He sold out his own wife. So if Abram was the same character, he would have said, hey, Lot, you got your wealth from me. You're the one that needs to get out of here. Does that make sense? Which is not what Abram is doing. So that means there was a change somewhere. The question is, what happened? This explains what happened. The chiasm. Abram saw God's salvation towards Sarah, and then he said, this is what true faith is about. This is why God called me out of Ur, so that Sarah can participate in this inheritance. Anyway, 8 minutes over. So any questions or comments? Okay. If there's no questions or comments, then let's pray, take offering, and then pray for one of our members and benediction.